Thank you. Welcome to this meeting of the Standing Committee on Rules and Procedures. I'm going to start off the meeting with a meditation. All rise. Thank you. If you wish to experience peace, provide peace for another. If you wish to know you are safe, cause another to know that they are safe. If you wish to understand seemingly incomprehensible things, help another to understand. If you wish to heal your own sadness or anger, seek to heal the sadness or anger of another. Dalai Lama. So we just have a few items that we need to go through before we can get into the clause-by-clause review. The only item of business today is our clause-by-clause review of Bill 56. We are not going to hold that, of course, in camera. That's going to be public. Any declarations of conflict of interest? Seeing none. Today's business, we're going to have a clause-by-clause review of Bill 56. So I'd like to welcome everybody to this public meeting, the Standing Committee on Rules and Procedures. My name is Kevin O'Reilly. I'm the chair of the committee. I'd like all of the committee members to introduce themselves, starting with Mr. Bolio.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Tom Bolio, MLA for Tuneda Willity.
Good afternoon. Welcome, Shane Thompson, Nahende.
Lucy Burt, Dapacha.
Julie Green, Yellowknife Center.
Thank you. We have some staff here, of course, with us today. Mr. Glenn Rutland is our committee clerk. Stephen Dunbar is our committee advisor. Cynthia James is our committee clerk trainee. And, law clerk Sheila McPherson. Today, the Standing Committee on Rules and Procedures is holding a clause-by-clause review of Bill 56, an act to amend the Legislative Assembly and Executive Council Act Number 2. I neglected to mention that we need a motion to accept the agenda. Mr. Thompson.
We accept the agenda as presented.
Thank you. We're okay with that moving forward? Thank you. As I mentioned, so we're here today to talk about Bill 56. Bill 56, an act to amend the Legislative Assembly and Executive Council Act Number 2, proposes to change the existing legislation by modify the oath of office sworn by members to include specific obligations, clarify the conflict of interest regime in respect of members and former members, require the adoption of the Legislative Assembly by the Legislative Assembly of a code of conduct that establishes standards for the conduct of members, require members to comply with any code of conduct adopted, create the Office of the Integrity Commissioner to carry out the duties of the former Conflict of Interest Commissioner, as well as similar duties in relation to the Code of Conflict. Clarify the obligations of members with respect to the receipt of gifts and personal benefits, and correct inconsistencies and errors identified in the Act. Bill 56 received second reading in the Legislative Assembly on June 4th, 2019, and was referred to the Standing Committee on Rules and Procedures for review. The committee sent letters inviting input from an extensive list of stakeholders, including municipal and Indigenous governments in the Northwest Territories, as well as a number of non-governmental organizations, civil society groups, and other stakeholders. Committee held public hearings in Fort Smith, Yellowknife, and Inuvik. Committee thanks everyone who attended those meetings or provided written submissions on Bill 56. There are copies of the bill on the side table. I will now invite the member for Yellowknife North, Corey Van Thyn, the sponsor of the bill, on behalf of the Board of Management, to make some opening remarks and introduce his witnesses. Mr. Van Thyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Oh, sorry. Does committee have any general... Oh, sorry. I'm a little rusty, obviously. I don't get to do this very often. Mr. Van Thyn, would you please introduce your witnesses for the record? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today I have with me Mr. Tim Mercer, Clerk of the Legislative Assembly, and as well I have with me Christina Brownlee, Legislation Division, Department of Justice. And I have opening comments.
Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On behalf of the Legislative Assembly Board of Management, I am pleased to appear before you today with respect to Bill 56, an act to amend the Legislative Assembly and Executive Act Number 2. Members will recall that this is the second bill to amend this act during the current session. Whereas the first bill, Bill 55, made a number of miscellaneous amendments to the act, the bill before you is focused largely on Part 3, which addresses conflicts of interest. Specifically, the bill makes changes to the oaths of office and allegiance sworn by all members and adds a third oath, the oath of loyalty. The bill also makes provisions for the adoption of a code of conduct by the Legislative Assembly, which will be enforceable by an integrity commissioner who will also carry out the duties of the current conflict of interest commissioner. Finally, Bill 56 clarifies the obligations of members with respect to the acceptance of personal gifts and personal benefits. This bill is the culmination of one of the first actions taken by the Assembly in its first months in office and direction of the Legislative Assembly that resulted from this committee's excellent work and recommendations. I understand that the Standing Committee has conducted public hearings on the bill, and I look forward to discussing any proposed amendments that may arise from these hearings and answering any questions you may have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. Does committee have any general comments or questions before we begin the clause-by-clause review? No? Okay. Does committee agree to conduct a clause-by-clause review of Bill 56, an act to amend the Legislative Assembly and Executive Council Act Number 2?
Agreed.
Thank you. We will defer the title of the bill until the end and begin with consideration of the clauses. There are 25 clauses in the bill. If you could please turn to the first page of the bill. Clause 1.
Agreed.
Clause 2.
Agreed.
Thank you. Clause 3. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The subclause 3, brackets 2 of Bill 56 be deleted and the following substituted. Brackets 2, subsection 73, bracket 2 is repealed and followed is substituted. Brackets 2, for the purpose of this part, a person or persons, a group of persons is the beneficiary owner, brackets A, of a revocable trust. Is that person or group of persons or trustees, settlers, or known beneficiaries of the trust. Brackets B, of an irrevocable trust if that person or group of persons are trustees or group beneficiaries of the trust. Bracket C, or a corporation if that person or group of persons directly or indirectly owns, control, or existing discretion over shares of the corporations. Brackets I, carried more than 10% of voting rights attached to all outstanding shares of the corporation, or brackets II, represents more than 10% of the fair market value of all outstanding shares of the corporation, or brackets D, or a partnership or entitled other than a corporation or trust if that person or group of persons directly or indirectly owns, controls, or exercises discretion over more than 10% of the fair market value of the entity. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. The motion is in order to the motion.
Question.
Just before we do the vote, I just want to take a moment to explain what this is really about. What we've done is change the definition that is in the current legislation around controlling interest to beneficial ownership. And what we did was, at the suggestion of one of the presenters at a public hearing, to adopt the definition of beneficial ownership essentially from federal legislation. We felt that it was a more modern use of that and would capture not just controlling interest, but an interest as defined here in the amendment. So, sorry, committee's in agreement with this motion?
Agreed.
Mr. Van Thyn, do you concur with this amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Van Thyn concurs with the amendment. Committee to Clause 3 is amended. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
Okay, we'll keep going. Clause 4.
Agreed.
Clause 5.
Agreed.
Clause 6.
Agree.
Clause 7. Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I move that Clause 7 of Bill 56 be amended by deleting the proposed paragraph 79, brackets 1, brackets B and bracket C, and substituting the following. An entity for which a member is a beneficiary owner, an entity for which an entity referred to in paragraph B is a beneficial owner singly or collectively with the member or any other entity referred to in paragraph B. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. The motion is in order. To the motion.
Question?
Question has been called. All those in favor?
Agree.
All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does Mr. Van Thyn concur with this amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. Committee to Clause 7 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agree.
Clause 8.
Agree.
Clause 9. Ms. Green.
Mr. Chair, I move that the paragraph 9, brackets 1, brackets M of Bill 56 be deleted and the following substituted, brackets M. That portion of subsection 89, brackets 1, preceding paragraph, brackets A.
Thank you, Ms. Green. The motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does Mr. Van Thyn concur with this amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. Mr. Van Thyn concurs with this amendment. Committee to Clause 9 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agree.
Clause 10,
Agree.
Clause 11,
Agree.
Clause 12,
Agree.
Clause 13,
Agree.
Clause 14. Minister Siebert.
That Clause 14 of Bill 56 be amended by deleting proposed paragraphs 85 in brackets 1, brackets B, and brackets C, and substituting the following, in brackets B, an entity for which a member is a beneficial owner, C, in bracket C, an entity for which an entity referred to in paragraph in brackets B is a beneficial owner, singly or collectively with the member or any other entity referred to in paragraph in brackets B. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Siebert. The motion is in order. To the motion.
Question?
Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does Mr. Van Thyn concur with this amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. Mr. Van Thyn concurs with the amendment. Committee to Clause 14 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agree.
Clause 15. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, that Clause 15 of Bill 56 be amended by deleting proposed subclause 86 brackets 4 and substituting the following. Brackets 4, where a member receives a gift or personal benefit, sorry about that, referred in the subsection brackets 2 have a value exceeding $400, the member shall, within 30 days after receiving the gift or personal benefit, file with Integrity Commission a disclosure report indicating sorry. Brackets A, description of the gift and personal benefits. Brackets B, the source of the gift or personal benefit. Bracket C, the value of the gift or personal benefits. And D, circumstances under which the gift or the personal benefit was given or accepted. Thank Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Appreciate your efforts in getting that out. Much appreciated. The motion is in order to the motion.
Question?
Thanks. Just before we go to that, the purpose of this amendment is to make sure that when members receive gifts in excess of $400, that's actually disclosed, and that the description of the gift, the source, and the value, and so on, is disclosed to the future Integrity Commissioner, and that becomes part of the public part of the report as well. I think there's another motion that will accomplish that. So we voted in. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does Mr. Van Thyn concur with this amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. Committee to Clause 15 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
Thank you. Clause 16. Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I move that Clause 16 of Bill 56 be amended in the English version of the proposed subclause 91 brackets 3 by striking out behavior and substituting it with behavior with the different spelling. Should I spell it out?
Thanks. I don't think that's necessary.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The motion is in order to the motion. Question's been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Does Mr. Van Thyn concur with this amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. That was just to correct an American to a British spelling. So we're on to Clause 17. Clause 17.
Agreed. Agreed.
Clause 18.
Agreed.
Clause 19.
Agreed.
Clause 20. Ms. Green.
Mr. Chair, I move that Clause 19 be amended by adding the following after subclause 20 brackets 2, brackets 3, subsection 106, brackets 2 is amended by striking out "and" to the clerk and substituting "to the Integrity Commissioner" and "to the clerk." Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Green. The motion is in order to the motion.
Question?
Mr. Siebert, no? Okay. Question's been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does Mr. Van Thyn concur with this amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. Committee to Clause 20 is amended. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
Clause 21?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Clause 22. Minister Siebert.
That Clause 22 of Bill 56 be amended in proposed form 2.1 by striking out "and that I will perform the duties of member honestly and justly in conformity with the Northwest Territories Act." Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Siebert. The motion is in order. Okay, I'll discuss it. What this does is, in the bill, there's a new oath of loyalty that members will swear or affirm, and the intent of this motion was to drop one of the paragraphs that talks about the Northwest Territories Act as sort of a pseudo-constitutional matter and something that we would adhere to, but sometimes we may need to talk about how we might change the Northwest Territories Act to better reflect the needs of our citizens. So it was felt that we should really drop that clause. It was suggested to us, so that's what this motion does accomplish. Anyone else wish to discuss this motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does Mr. Van Thyn concur with this motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Van Thyn concurs with the motion. Committee to Clause 22 is amended. Does committee agree?
Agree.
Thank you. Clause 23? 22. Thank you. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That Clause 22 of the Bill 56 be amended in the English version of proposed Form 2-1 by striking out honor and substituting honor. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Mr. Thompson. The motion is in order to the motion.
Question?
Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does Mr. Van Thyn concur with this amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur. Thank you.
Mr. Van Thyn concurs with the amendment. Thank you. Committee to Clause 22 is amended. Does committee agree?
Agree.
Thanks. That was just to correct another American spelling. Clause 23. Clause 23.
Agreed.
Clause 24.
Agreed.
Clause 25.
Agreed.
Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry. That Bill 56 be amended by adding the following after Clause 9. 9.1 the paragraph 80 brackets 1 brackets A and brackets B are repealed and the following is substituted. Brackets A, an entity in which the member is a beneficiary owner, or brackets B, an entity which an entity referred to in paragraph A, for brackets A, is a beneficiary owner, singular or collectively with the member or any other entity referred to in paragraph A. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Go to the motion. The motion is in order to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does Mr. Van Thyn concur with this motion or this amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Van Thyn concurs with this amendment. Committee to Clause 9.1. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
Thank you. Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, that Bill 56 be amended by adding the following immediately before Clause 10. 9.2, paragraphs 81, brackets 3A and brackets B are repealed and the following is substituted. A, an entity for which the speaker or minister or his or her spouse or dependent children individually or collectively are a beneficial owner, or B, an entity for which an entity is referred to in paragraph brackets A is a beneficial owner, singly or collectively, with the speaker or minister or his or her spouse or dependent children or any other entity referred to in paragraph brackets A. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Green. The motion is in order to the motion.
Question?
Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does Mr. Van Thyn concur with this amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. Mr. Van Thyn concurs with the amendment. Committee to Clause 9.2. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
Thank you. Mr. Siebert?
That Bill 56 be amended by adding the following after Clause 10. 10.1, Section 83 is repealed and the following is substituted. 83. For the purposes of Sections 83.1 to 83.5, transition period means, brackets A, in respect of a former member who served as Speaker or as a minister within 12 months before ceasing to hold office as a member, the 12 months after the member ceases to hold office, and B, brackets B, in respect of any other former member, the 4 months after the member ceases to hold office. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Siebert. The motion is in order to the motion. Thanks. I just want to explain a little bit about what's going on here. What this would do is change the transition period for former regular MLAs. Under the current legislation, if you've served one term, the transition period is 4 months. If you've served 2 terms, it's 8 months, and 3 or more, it's 12 months. So this would reduce the transition period to 4 months for regular MLAs, and committee was of the view that we don't really want to penalize people that have served as MLAs. We want to attract high-quality people to this office, and that because regular MLAs don't really serve in a decision-making capacity, that a 4-month transition period was adequate. So that's the purpose of this amendment. And sorry, committee, can you vote again on the motion for me? Those in agreement? Thank you. Any opposed? Motion is carried. Mr. Van Thyn, do you concur with the amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Van Thyn concurs with the amendment. Committee to clause 10.1. Does committee agree?
Agree.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson?
Mr. Chair, that Bill 56 be amended by adding the following immediately before clause 11. 10.2 paragraph 83.2 brackets A and brackets B are repealed, and the following is substituted. Brackets A, an entity in which the former member is a beneficial owner, or B, brackets B, an entity in which an entity referred to in paragraph A is a beneficiary owner. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. The motion is in order to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does Mr. Van Thyn concur with this amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Van Thyn concurs with this amendment. Committee to 10.2. Does committee agree? Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I move that Bill 56 be amended by adding the following clause after clause 15, 15.1, paragraph 87, brackets 2, brackets C is repealed, and the following is substituted. Bracket C, all interests of the member and his or her spouse and dependent children in a trust, corporation, partnership, or similar entity, including a statement identifying brackets 1 or I, an entity for which the member, spouse, and dependent children are individually or collectively beneficial owners, and double I, brackets double I, an entity for which an entity referred to in subparagraph brackets I is a beneficial owner singly or collectively with a member, spouse, and dependent children, and any other entity referred to in subparagraph brackets I. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. The motion is in order to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does Mr. Van Thyn concur with this amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Van Thyn concurs with this amendment. Committee to clause 15.1. Does committee agree?
Agree.
Ms. Green.
That Bill 56 be amended by adding the following immediately before clause 16. 15.2 subsection 89 brackets 3 is repealed, and the following is substituted. Brackets 3. The Integrity Commissioner shall prepare and publish on a website maintained by the Legislative Assembly a register containing A, public disclosure statements and supplemental public disclosure statements prepared under this section. B, annual reports prepared under subsection 99 brackets 1. C, any reports of late filing or non-filing of disclosure statements prepared under subsection 99 brackets 2. D, any reports prepared under subsection 102 brackets 1. E, any reports of sole adjudicators under subsection 106 brackets 1. And F, any other information the Integrity Commissioner considers necessary. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Green. The motion is in order to the motion. Thanks. Just before we go to the vote, this is about creating more publicly accessible information about conflict of interest matters, integrity matters, and there will now be a place, or there will be a place on the, assuming the bill gets passed in the House, there will be a place on the Legislative Assembly website where this information can be made more readily accessible. So, question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does Mr. Van Thyn concur with this amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur. Thank you.
Mr. Van Thyn concurs with this amendment. Thank you. Committee to clause 15.2. Does committee agree? Thank you. Minister Siebert.
That Bill 56 be amended by adding the following after clause 18. 18.1, subsection 99 in brackets 1 is amended. Brackets A, by striking out "and" at the end of the English version of paragraph in brackets D. Paragraph B, by striking out the period at the end of paragraph in brackets E, and substituting and C in brackets, by adding the following after paragraph in brackets E, brackets F, a statement identifying any recommended changes to this act.
Thank you, Minister Siebert. The motion is in order to the motion. So just before we go to the vote, that's a lot of wording, and what this really does is add an additional power or authority to the Conflict of Interest Commissioner in making annual reports. That individual can now recommend changes to the Act. So a lot of those words for a small amendment that we felt would be helpful, allowing them to improve how we deal with ourselves and so on. So that's the intent here. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does Mr. Van Thyn concur with this amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Van Thyn concurs with the amendment. Committee to clause 18.2. Does committee agree? Thank you. Mr. Thompson?
That Bill 56 be amended by adding the following immediately before clause 19, 18.2 subsection 102 brackets 3 is repealed. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Mr. Thompson. The motion is in order to the motion.
Question?
Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does Mr. Van Thyn concur with this amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Van Thyn concurs with the amendment. Committee to clause 18.2. Does committee agree?
Can you just call 18.1 again? Because we never actually called it.
Okay, sorry. I was asked to call clause 18.1 again. Does committee agree?
Agree.
Thank you. Thank you. We will now return to the bill number entitled Bill 56, an act to amend the Legislative Assembly and Executive Council Act Number 2. Does committee agree?
Agree.
The bill as a whole, does committee agree?
Agree.
Does committee agree that Bill 56, an act to amend the Legislative Assembly and Executive Council Act Number 2, is now ready for consideration in committee of the whole? Ms. Green?
I move Bill 56, an act to amend the Legislative Assembly and Executive Council Act Number 2, be reported to the Assembly as ready for consideration in Committee of the Whole, as amended and reprinted.
Thank you. The motion is in order to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Bill 56, an act to amend the Legislative Assembly and Executive Council Act Number 2, will be reported to the Assembly as ready for consideration in Committee of the Whole as amended and reprinted. Thank you. Mr. Van Thyn, do you have any closing remarks?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one more time, I want to take the opportunity to thank committee for the hard work that they have done on this and the public hearing you conducted, and happy to see that these motions were made and we've improved the act. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. Just before we close, so the public knows what's happening, the committee also had a number of comments on the draft code of conduct and the guidelines that go along with that. There will be, we are going to make some changes to those. The revised version of the document will be tabled in the House next week. The adoption of it will have to be done on the last day after the changes to the Act are brought into force, at least for the Code of Conduct. So it will then become legally binding on the next Assembly. So, but just wanted folks to know that there will be some changes made to the Code of Conduct as a result of the public input. So thanks, everybody, for your attendance today, and much appreciated. Thanks to our staff as well. Thank you. Motion to adjourn. Mr. Thompson, any objections? No. Thank you. Okay. This concludes the meeting. Thank you. Sorry, can members stay behind?